Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dale Jarvis. And if you look at the number one plaque over here on the right-hand side, you'll see his name is in brass, and that's because Dale, earlier this year, became a legend in the City of Legends, and that's the city's marketing strategy, the City of Legends. He was noted for his contribution to enhancing the tourism industry here in the city. And I'm just going to go ahead and read a little bio that I have, because I don't want to, he has so many accomplishments, I certainly don't want to leave any of them out. By day, he works as the Intangible Cultural Heritage Development Officer for the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, helping communities safeguard traditional culture, the only full-time, provincially funded folklorist position in Canada. He regularly teaches workshops on oral history, cultural documentation, folklore project management, and public folklore programming. By night, Dale is the proprietor of St. John's Haunted Hike, ghost tour, and a raconteur of local tales. And I think many of you are going to the Haunted Hike this evening. I said to him one time, I said, Dale, you frighten me. And he looked rather hurt, but I meant his alter ego himself. As a storyteller, he performs ghost stories, stories of the fairies and the little people, tales of phantom ships and superstitions, of legends and traditional tales of Newfoundland and Labrador and beyond. His repertoire includes long-form folk and fairy tales from the island, with a wide-ranging knowledge of local legends, tall tales, and myths. He's a newspaper columnist, an author of several books on Newfoundland and Labrador, ghost stories and folklore, and he is a tireless promoter of our local culture. And as I said before, Dale won the City of Legends Award for his outstanding work in the development and enhancement of tourism in the City of St. John's. Without any further ado, Dale Jarvis.
Thank you very much, Burnett. Burnett said the most important thing for me to say today was about how she has been a personal inspiration to me. That's it, right? That was the most important thing to say. Yeah. Which is true. I mean, the city has been an amazing partner with the work that I've done over the past 20 years. And it is a real delight and a treat to be here today to talk to you all. Bernadette also suggested that I give you the entire cultural history of Newfoundland and Labrador, from the prehistoric era to 2015, in the next 12 minutes, which I will certainly attempt to do. In particular, though, what she did ask me to speak about was about our fairy traditions here in Newfoundland. I could tell you many, many stories about Newfoundland, but I know the fairies creep Bernadette out, so we'll stick with that for now. Folklore in general in Newfoundland and in Labrador is a very special thing. We have a very ancient history here. We have a very old Aboriginal culture here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and a very long period of European contact and occupation here in Newfoundland as well. And that goes back to about 998 AD, when the Vikings first came to this part of North America and established a settlement at Lansing Meadows on the Great Northern Peninsula. And they didn't stay very long. But by the 15th century, Europeans were starting to build settlements here in Newfoundland and in Labrador. The city that you're in today dates to 1497. There are some very old settlements in Labrador. The Basque, we know, had established pretty much permanent settlements in Labrador by 1530, which really calls into question that idea that Columbus was the first one to discover North America in 1492. The Basques certainly knew about it before he did. The Vikings knew about it centuries before. People came here because of the fish, or the whales in the case of the Spaniards. And settlement evolved in Newfoundland in tiny little outport communities, which were scattered along a very, very long coastline. And people started to bring with them old traditions from Europe, largely from England and from Ireland. And traditions persisted here in a way that they didn't in other places. And when you hear Newfoundlanders talk, you can hear that in their speech. People will still say things like the two of ye. 17th century English has still survived in certain phrases and phraseology here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the other thing that has survived are a lot of legends and local traditions. And I have a great interest in the local folklore of the province and all these little tiny survivals that have adapted and changed here. And fairy traditions are certainly one of those. I think there's a common misconception in much of North America, and even in Newfoundland, that a lot of fairy traditions are somehow Irish. Newfoundlanders are very passionate in some communities about their Irish heritage, and certainly that is an important part of the development of local culture. But much of the early settlement here was from West Country England. And when we look at a lot of the fairy traditions that exist here, many of them come from an English fairy tradition as well. Much of Northern Europe had a fairy tradition, everywhere from Iceland to Scandinavia, the Germanic countries, the French-speaking countries. They all had fairy traditions of their own. The fairy traditions that exist here are, in some ways, a very unique Newfoundland type of fairy tradition. It is not particularly Irish, and it's not really even particularly English. What it is Newfoundland. It's a blending of traditions that has existed over the past 500 years of settlement. Fairies in Newfoundland are also not nice. So you can banish from your thoughts all those images of quaint gossamer-winged creatures frolicking at the ends of the garden. How many of you were in brownies? Yes, not those kind of fairies at all. The fairies in Newfoundland are generally not very nice and are creatures of power which are meant to be respected and, where possible, avoided. And most of the stories that we collect about fairies, or that we hear about fairies, involve someone who has somehow trespassed on fairy land or fairy territory and has suffered as a result of that. There's a great tradition here in Newfoundland of what is known in various communities as a blast. So if you are so unfortunate as to venture onto land that has been occupied by the fairies, you might receive a fairy blast, or a fairy arrow, or fairy strike, or fairy shot. There's a story from Witless Bay, south of here, about a young boy who was out perhaps later one night than his mother had given him permission to be out. And he was coming home and there was a bog, a section of bog, which there was a path that led around. But he'd always been told not to cut through the bog. But on this night, when he was walking home or trying to get home in a hurry, there seemed to be a beautiful clear path right across the bog. And so without hesitation, the boy stepped out onto the pathway. And in the center of the bog was a slight mound, a rise. The boy stood up onto that mound, and as soon as he did so, he felt a great pain in the back of his leg, as if someone had taken a knife and had driven it into his flesh. The boy limped home, and by the time he got home, he was in tremendous, tremendous pain. And his mother's anger at him being late dissipated when she saw that he was actually in great torment. And they rolled up the boy's pant leg, and they could see on the back of his leg that there was a great swelling on his leg. And so the mother made a traditional bread poultice and put it on the strange wound, sent the boy to bed. But in the morning, the boy was in a delirium, in a fever, and the swelling had increased on the back of his leg. The boy was in obvious pain. And word had kind of spread. This was in the era before telephones or social media, but word travels fast in Newfoundland communities. And an older man came to the house, a man that had a reputation of knowing things that other men might not, and he looked at the boy's leg and he knew what had to be done, and he got the boy's father and his uncles to hold the boy down at the kitchen table. And he called for a sharp knife and some clean towels, hot water. And he took the knife and he cut open the swelling on the back of the boy's leg, and from inside the swelling came bits of moss and tiny little bones and feathers, and the man scooped it out of the wound and wrapped it up in the towel and threw it into the wood stove where it burned with an angry hiss. And then, using the mother's best needle and thread, he sewed up the back of the boy's leg. And the boy lived. And he lived to be an old man. And he walked with a limp from that day forward, and people at Witless Bay said it was always because he had dared to venture on the territory that had belonged to the fairies. I know that you have an interest or have had some discussions over the last few days about territory and place and spaces here in Newfoundland. And the fairies do not exist in the wild, and nor do they exist in civilized spaces. They exist on the margins between those two, those liminal spaces where things are in play and at flux. And it's always in those strange places, like where you might go to pick berries, or walking on trails between communities that you might...
That is not nice.
There was a man walking along a trail between two communities in Trinity Bay. And he looked back at one point and he saw far off in the distance a man walking on the same path as he was. And the man thought, as he came up to a little pond, he thought, maybe I'll just stop here, I'll have a drink of water, and I'll wait for this other man to come along. Conversation makes a journey shorter, as the saying goes. And he bent down to scoop some water into the pond. And when he looked down into the water, he could see his own reflection. And standing immediately behind him, he could see the face of another man. And he looked up, and here was the man that had moments before been all that distance back along the path. And the stranger smiled at the gentleman. He smiled a great smile, and as he smiled, his mouth opened from ear to ear, and his lower jaw dropped down to reveal row upon row of sharp little teeth. The gentleman was so startled that he fell over into the water, and when he righted himself again, the stranger had disappeared completely. And it was said that that man never walked that path. And this was kind of a typical interaction with the fairies. They can take what forms they wish. Sometimes they are seen, sometimes they are hidden. There's a great tradition here of fairies appearing in whirlwinds, small gusts of wind, seen quite often at haying time. And there were stories of people being picked up and carried away, men and women being carried away by the fairies. It is a terrible thing in Newfoundland to be away with the fairies, to be taken away. And there are many, many stories about people who have disappeared or have had strange experiences. What is fascinating for people who study traditional folklore are the ways in which these legends continue to be told today. In Newfoundland, stories of people who are taken away by the fairies follow patterns of fairy stories that happen in other parts of Europe, but generally a person is suddenly finds themselves in a strange location. They are returned, somehow changed. We say someone might be away in the fairies if they are distracted. They might return touched by the fairies, maybe unable to speak or having undergone some sort of change in some way. And often with the sensation that time has shifted, that they have perhaps been gone 5 minutes, but in reality they've been gone 3 days. These are ancient, ancient stories. The stories of the fairy blast go back to the Anglo-Saxon period in written literature, and they continue to be told today. And when we look at these fairy stories, what do fairies do? They abduct people. They shoot things into their bodies. You're returned days later, missing time. There are strange lights. They make circular patterns in the grass. Do any of these sound familiar? Those of you who've ever heard any modern alien abduction stories are really just listening to fairy stories. Told and retold and reinvented in a modern age. Newfoundlanders have developed rather elaborate systems of precautions against fairies too, and depending on where you go, people will offer you advice on what you should do to keep the fairies at bay. The best thing, of course, is just to avoid them altogether, but if you suddenly find yourself in a strange location, in a landscape you don't recognize, you might wish to remove an article of clothing and turn it inside out and put it back on, or turn your pockets inside out. It is advisable to carry breadcrumbs with you. Bread is sometimes said to be a charm against the fairies, or coins in your pockets. And there were stories in previous generations of mothers pinning money to their children in the cradle or in the carriage to keep the fairies from stealing their children. This idea of fairies abducting children is again a very old European story, where the fairies will steal away a child and replace it with a changeling baby. Fairies, it is said, cannot conceive on their own, and that is why they steal human children, to turn them into fairies. These are ancient stories, but they are stories that are still told. 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, myself and a fellow folklorist, Lisa Wilson, worked on a project in Bay Roberts, which is a hotbed of fairy activity, only about an hour from here. And we were talking with a series of grade 10 students, English students, writing students. And we did an introduction to folklore research with them, and we taught them how to ask questions, open-ended questions, and we sent them out to interview their parents and grandparents and neighbors, and they came back with remarkable stories. Stories about the fairies, stories about folk cures, how to get rid of warts and things like that, lovely stories about hauntings and buried treasures. One boy came back with a story that he learned from his grandmother. He'd interviewed his grandmother the night before, and he told this story that he didn't know was a fairy story. His grandmother told him the story, and in the story, she told him she was a baby. So this would have taken place maybe 70 years before. Her mother had, one day in winter, decided that she would put the baby in the cradle, and put the cradle outside. It was believed to help the child's development, to give the child some fresh air in the winter. So she put the cradle outside with a sheet over it. And she came back a few minutes later to check on the child and pulled back the sheet, and inside the cradle was an ugly little old man in this cradle. And so the mother of the baby picked up the baby and threw the baby into a snowbank, went over and dug the baby out of the snowbank and found that it was her own real baby that had been returned, and she put it back in the cradle. So this young boy came in and told us this story that had happened to his grandmother. His grandmother had been the baby who had been taken away. And he didn't know anything about changeling stories. It wasn't a word that he'd ever heard. But what he had just told was obviously a story of the fairies. This was a very ancient story, and there are some very, very famous Irish stories of people doing things to these changeling babies to return them, including, in some instances, putting the changeling baby on a shovel and holding the shovel over the fire until it was returned, which actually led to a very famous murder case in Ireland, the burning of Bridget Cleary, which you can read about. So having given you these terrible, terrible stories of the fairies, I will end with a positive story about the fairies, a true story. This is a story that I learned from my Aunt Betty Slaney, who was from the community of Britannia on Random Island. And Aunt Betty Slaney told me this story, which she had been a part of. It was a story about her great aunt, Aunt Sadie Curry. Aunt Sadie Curry this is an aside, Aunt Sadie Curry had been married to Uncle Moses Curry, who had gone out one night and had died on the street. He had suffered a heart attack and perished on the street. And his spirit returned ever after to haunt the pothole in which he had died. Aunt Betty said that as a young girl, she was terrified to go out for a walk for fear of seeing Uncle Moses' ghost standing in a pothole. Potholes are something of a tradition in Newfoundland and Labrador, you might see from some of our streets. Only ghost that haunts a pothole I know. Anyway, Aunt Sadie lived for many years afterwards. And she had a lovely house, which was still standing in the early 90s, mid-90s. Beautiful two-story sharp peak roofed house. And it was the house where people would stay when they came to visit. So if the magistrate or the doctor came to visit, she ran a little boarding house in the center of the community to supplement her income, where she was a widow. And she was known to be a very strict but a very kind woman. And she loved music. She always had music. And if you went to Aunt Sadie's house, you had to sing a song or recite a poem or do a dance. She had a pump organ, one of those old foot pump organs in the parlor. She would play that. There was always music at Aunt Sadie's house. One day in the fall of the year, when Aunt Sadie was in her 70s, she went out picking squash berries in the fall of the year, and she did not return that night. This was in the years before Confederation, so probably in the 1930s, late 30s, early 40s. And she was an older woman. In the fall of the year, people were worried, and they went out looking for her, and they couldn't find Aunt Sadie. And when she didn't return the next day, and they still couldn't find her, word kind of spread around to the other little fishing communities. Britannia, Lower Lions Cove and Petley, Hickman's Harbor, everyone was out searching for Aunt Sadie Curry, and no one could find her for 11 days and 11 nights. They searched the ponds, they searched along the coastline, but there was no sign of her. Someone in Britannia had a crate of oranges, and this was a rare thing in those days. You might get an orange if you were lucky in your stocking at Christmas, an orange from Spain. It was the only time you could see an orange. And somehow someone had a crate of oranges in the fall of the year. And they came upon this brilliant idea that if they took these oranges out in the woods, they would kind of leave the oranges around. They were bright, and Aunt Sadie would see them and know that they were an unusual thing and know that people were out looking for her. And my Aunt Betty could remember kind of looking after some of the younger children while the adults were all off in the wood looking for Aunt Sadie. As I said, 11 days went by. And a gentleman happened back upon a spot where they had previously searched, and there was Aunt Sadie sitting underneath the tree, surrounded by orange peels. And he said, "Aunt Sadie, I've come to take you home." And he helped her up, and he took her out of the woods and took her home. And she had some bug bites and scratches on her face, like you would if you'd been in the woods for 11 days and 11 nights, but she wasn't cold, and she wasn't wet, and she wasn't hungry. And Nan Leewood, Aunt Betty's mother, who was then a young girl, was sent to look after her. A young woman, rather, was sent out to look after Aunt Sadie for a little bit. And Aunt Betty could remember the church bells ringing in Britannia to let everyone know that Aunt Sadie was found. And Aunt Sadie Curry was fine. She was quite fine. And she lived for many years afterwards. And when anyone asked her where she had been, she said, "Oh, I was away with the fairies." And when anyone asked her what that was like, she said, "Oh, the music. They played such beautiful music." And that's my story.
Dale, I was wondering if you'd just give us a little bit of an overview of the Mummering tradition and the Mummers Festival.
yes.
To some of the ideas.
Sure. Switching gears. The Mummering tradition is a Christmas tradition that, again, is a European tradition and which was introduced in Newfoundland very, very early. The word mummer comes from an old Germanic word basically meaning a mask. So you're masked in some way. People still use the word variously in Newfoundland. Sometimes older people in Newfoundland will say at Halloween, "Oh, I had some mummers last night," meaning I had some children who were in a mask. It is a disguised tradition, largely a disguised tradition, that happens during the 12 days of Christmas. 12 days of Christmas are very important here. People still have old Christmas Day parties in Newfoundland, January 6th, where people would go from house to house disguised, and there would be a bit of a party at each house. And it was a bit of a guessing game. People would try to guess who was underneath all the clothing, and if you could guess who the person was, you might get a bit of a drink, you would put your clothing back on and you'd go on to the next house. In a very basic form, that is what mummering is. So it exists in a bewildering variety of smaller forms and varieties across the province. The tradition, as I said, came to Newfoundland very, very early. One of the sort of micro-traditions that I'm interested in is the tradition of the hobby horse, which is not the children's toy hobby horse, but the head of a horse. In early days, it was actually the skull of a horse with a blanket behind it or a body under which men or women would get and come in at the end of a group of mummers. It was an element of chaos that would come in at the end. We know the first hobby horse was here in Newfoundland in 1583, so it's an ancient tradition here. Mummering was incredibly popular in both urban settings, where it was more of a parade-type atmosphere, a general carousing on the streets. In rural places, it was more of this individual house visit type of tradition. In Newfoundland in the 1800s, the opportunity to dress up in disguise, mixed with propensity to drink, led to some violence, I guess is the perhaps a polite way to put it. It was a time in certain locations where old scores could be settled. And mummers were generally known not to be terribly friendly. Today we think of mummers as kind of a friendly, happy tradition. In the 1800s there was certainly an element of mummering that was quite violent, which culminated around 1860 with the murder of a man by the name of Isaac Mercer in Bay Roberts, who was beset upon by a group of mummers and struck in the head with an axe, and later perished from his wounds. That and a number of other attacks led to the government of the day first trying to license mummering. They had this idea that you would go to the magistrate, you would get a number, like at a road race, and you would put it on your chest, and then everyone would know who the mummers were. That proved to not work at all. So in 1861, they completely banned the practice of mummering. There was an act that made mummering illegal in Newfoundland. And what that did was largely eliminate these kind of large public gatherings of mummers in more urban centers, though it persisted in rural communities for a very, very long time. It persisted more or less right up until the 1980s, when the tradition really started to fade. And it started to fade for a number of reasons. I've been told anecdotally by people who grew up in outdoor communities that it ceased to become as popular in rural communities when people started to get indoor carpeting. Mummers would come in with their muddy boots, and you didn't want mummers on your carpet. But it also, I think it really happened when kind of society shifted a little bit in Newfoundland. Mummering was a tradition where you would know people in your community. And the core of mummering in rural communities was that these masked, frightening strangers would come into your house and then reveal themselves to be your friends and your relatives. And as communities shifted, as people didn't know their neighbors in quite the same way, it became less safe and less certain. So the tradition really did change. As communities became more urbanized, the tradition faded. But over the years, there have been revival movements. In the 1980s, there was a local musical group called Simini, who released a song called the Mummers Song, which was incredibly popular. They put it out on a vinyl 45. It became incredibly popular. And that was the first kind of revival of mummering. But by the 90s, again, interest had started to fade. And when we started the Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, we were looking at traditions that were under threat. And you could go into any craft store, anywhere in Newfoundland and Labrador, and you could buy something with a mummer on it. You could buy mummer tea towels and mummer cards and mummer dolls, mummer t-shirts. But a lot of people just had never experienced the tradition of mummering, especially people who'd grown up in urban centers. And so we created, about 6 years ago, the St. John's Mummers Festival, which was an attempt to recreate this tradition and to bring attention to it. The festival started, it was a month-long festival which had lectures and workshops, talks, and a school program which culminated in a giant parade, or what we hoped would be a giant parade. And we tried to recreate that idea of a house visit, where people would meet in one place and rig up, dress up, they would march through the streets, they would go to another place, and there would be a bit of a party and a dance, and purity syrup, which is a sweet drink, and fruitcake and whatnot. And we partnered with a local school to be the starting spot, and the rooms are our provincial museum and archives as the end point. And we put the word out that we're having a mummers parade. And people said, great, I can't wait to come to the parade. I can't wait to see the parade. And we said, it's not that kind of parade. It's not a parade that you come and watch, it's a parade that you come and participate in. It's a participatory experience. And we had hoped that first year myself and Ryan Davis, who is the mummer in charge of the Mummers Festival,
The mummer in charge.
He is, yes, he is a great force behind the Mummers Festival today. We thought maybe we could get 50 or so people. That would be great. We thought that would be great. We had about 300 people that showed up that first year. And pretty much every year since then, it has doubled every year in size. So now we'll get 3,000 people showing up to participate in the Mummers Parade. It is, and it has been a remarkable example of how dying traditions can be revitalized. When we started that tradition, we went looking for hobby horses. We knew that there was this 400-year history of hobby horses in the province in certain locations. We could find 5 hobby horses that existed in archival or private collections. and no one had made one probably since the 1970s. And so we created workshops around building hobby horses, and we have taught hundreds and hundreds of people to build hobby horses. We've taught workshops to teachers who've gone into their schools and then taught their students how to make them. I taught a teacher's workshop where we had a teacher come in from one of the schools in northern Labrador, and after the workshop, she said to me, these are little Inuit kids. She said, they've never seen a horse. They don't know what a horse is. She said, do you think we can adapt this and make hobby polar bears? And I said, absolutely, you can do whatever you want. So they went off and they made these fabulous polar bear hobby horses that were all neon colors, neon pink polar bears and green polar bears and all kinds of random stuff. So we've seen how the work that we do can really revitalize tradition, and what we are seeing now is that we've actually grown so large that we've outgrown the fire capacity of the museum. We can't even do the festival indoors anymore. It's gotten so big. And a couple of years ago, we were doubling every year. The first year where we didn't double was the first year we had done the festival outdoors, and the day of the parade came and it was minus 35 degrees. And we thought no one is going to come to this parade, and we still had about 2,000 people come out in minus 35 weather to revitalize this tradition. And we're seeing lots of young families, a whole new generation of people coming and participating in the parade. Bernadette, does that answer your question?
I just want to point out that the Mothers Festival was an event of the year for the city.
It was an event of the year for the city. Yes. Any questions? Yes. The Mummers Parade is held on, it's a good question. The date varies. I think this year it's December 15th or 16th. And we deliberately set the parade outside of the normal mummering season, in part because we were working with the museum and trying to organize something between Christmas and New Year's was very difficult, but also because we wanted it to be an educational piece and an inspirational piece that would encourage people who participated in the big parade to then go and do it at the family level in their own communities or with their own family and friends. So we do it a bit early, but the date changes every year. The festival runs anywhere from a month to a week with all kinds of different activities, lectures, and workshops. We've brought mummers in from Ireland. There's a huge mummers festival in Philadelphia, which is completely different from our mummering tradition. It's kind of a blend of Mardi Gras traditions and other traditions. So we had someone come out the very first year to talk about that. Yeah.
There's actually, you wrote a whole book about mummers that you can find.
Available wherever fine literature is sold.
But you didn't point it out.
Any Mummers Allowed In by Dale Jarvis. You can get it on Amazon, or you can go to dalejarvis.ca and you can get it from there. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Are you leading the ghost tour tonight?
That is a good question. I think so. I think I have 4 guides that we work with, but I think I'm doing it tonight with one of my other guides. Yeah.
You'll get some of us there.
You're scared, I'm telling you now.
Good.
I'm in the streets, I still avoid.